October 1899. The South African veldt stretches endlessly beneath a blood-red sky. Dust drifts across the dry grass. Somewhere out there, hidden behind the rocky ridges and thornbush, waits an enemy unlike any Britain had faced before, tough, patient, and invisible. The Boers, farmers turned fighters, expert marksmen, masters of the terrain. For weeks, they had been humiliating the British Empire, seizing railways, ambushing convoys, and cutting communication lines. And now, they threatened the key town of Ladysmith, the gateway to the interior of Natal. Britain needed a victory. Fast. At dawn on the 21st of October, a small British column gathered near the rail junction at Elandslaagte. Just 3,500 men, a patchwork of infantry, cavalry, and guns. They were cold, hungry, and exhausted, but they were ready. At their head rode Major General John French, a sharp-eyed cavalry officer known for his speed and aggression. French had orders: drive the Boers off the ridge and reopen the railway. A simple command, but far from a simple task. The Boers, nearly 1,000 strong, held the high ground. They had entrenched positions, field guns, and a sweeping view of the open veldt. Any assault would mean charging across open terrain, straight into a storm of Mauser fire. Still, French didn't hesitate. He had the 5th Lancers and 5th Dragoon Guards, his cavalry, the Gordon Highlanders and the Manchester Regiment, his infantry, and, crucially, the 21st and 42nd Batteries of the Royal Field Artillery, his hammer. It was a small force, but well-balanced, and French knew how to use it. As the first light crept over the horizon, the men began to move. The ground was uneven, pitted with anthills and scrub. Dust clung to their boots and rifles. Every step forward felt heavier than the last. Private Thomas Jenkins of the Manchester Regiment would later write in his diary, "We marched in silence, only the wind and the jingle of bayonets. None of us spoke. We all knew this would be our first fight." The officers rode ahead, scanning the ridges through their field glasses. Somewhere beyond that haze of morning light, the Boers were watching too. At 6:30 a.m., the first Boer shell screamed overhead. A plume of dust erupted beside the column. Men ducked. Horses reared. The battle had begun. French immediately ordered his artillery forward. The 42nd Battery unlimbered on a low rise, their guns thundering into position. Moments later, boom, the British returned fire. Shells arced through the sky, exploding among the rocky Boer positions. From the ridgeline, Boer snipers answered back with deadly precision. Bullets hissed through the grass, snapping at the heels of advancing troops. The British hugged the ground, waiting for the order to move. It came soon enough. French's plan was bold, textbook combined arms. While the artillery kept the Boers pinned, the infantry would advance in 2 waves. The Manchester Regiment on the left, the Devonshires and the Gordon Highlanders on the right. Behind them, the cavalry waited for the signal, ready to strike. But before they could attack, they needed to close the distance. And that meant marching, slowly, painfully, across nearly a mile of open ground. Private Jenkins again. The bullets came like bees. You could hear them humming past your ears. We kept our heads down and pushed on. God help the man who raised his head. By mid-morning, the sun blazed high. The veldt shimmered in the heat. Sweat and powder smoke mingled in the air. The British lines crept closer, a sea of khaki advancing under fire. General French rode behind them, calm but focused. He knew this was no ordinary enemy. The Boers didn't fight like European armies. They didn't stand in neat ranks. They were behind rocks, fired, and vanished, ghosts with rifles. And yet, French's men pressed on, step by step, yard by yard. Lieutenant Arthur Thompson of the Gordon Highlanders later recalled, "There was a moment, halfway across the plain, when I thought we would all be cut down. The fire was so intense, but then I heard the pipes. Our pipers began to play, and we rose again. The sound gave us strength. The skirl of the Highland bagpipes pierced the raw battle. It was raw, defiant, unbreakable. The men surged forward once more, hearts pounding to the rhythm of the drums and pipes. By noon, French's artillery had silenced one of the Boer guns. The enemy fire slackened, just enough for the infantry to reach the base of the ridge. They took cover among the rocks, catching their breath. Smoke drifted across the field. Behind them, wounded men cried for water. But there was no time to stop. The next order would be the hardest yet, the uphill assault. French looked to his officers. He knew what was coming, and so did they. The sun was burning low now, the light turning golden across the veldt. The moment of decision had arrived. At 3 p.m., French gave the command, "Advance. Take the ridge." The Highlanders fixed bayonets. The Manchesters rose from cover. And as the artillery thundered one last barrage over their heads, the British line began to climb, step by step, into the fire. The storm had broken, and the Battle of Elandslaagte had truly begun. The men moved as one, silent but for the crunch of boots and the low clink of equipment. The air was dry, heavy with dust and cordite. Somewhere ahead, the enemy ridge loomed like a sleeping beast. Every man could see it now, a jagged line of rock and scrub dotted with muzzle flashes. The Boers were waiting. For the British infantry, this was the worst kind of ground, open, exposed, merciless. There was no cover, no concealment, only the faint hope that artillery fire might keep the Boers' heads down. Yet even under the storm of shells, the Boer riflemen fired steadily, each shot deliberate, precise. They were hunters in their element. Major General John French watched from a low rise, his field glasses fixed on the enemy trenches. He had been in battle before, but this was different. These were not native levies or irregular raiders. The Boers were Europeans, disciplined, determined, and well-armed. Each man carried a Mauser rifle, modern and deadly accurate. Each knew the land intimately. The first British advance began at noon. The Gordon Highlanders, in their dark tartan kilts, took the right flank. The Manchesters advanced in the center, the Devonshires to the left. Behind them, a battery of field guns pounded the Boer Ridge in rhythm. Boom, 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 sending up fountains of earth and smoke. French's plan was simple but elegant. Pin the enemy with artillery, drive the infantry straight up the center, and hold the cavalry in reserve to deliver the final blow once the Boers began to break. It was a dangerous plan, but one that fit French's character. He believed in momentum. Attack fast, strike hard, never give the enemy time to recover. As the infantry advanced, the Boers opened a withering fire. The sound was unlike anything the British soldiers had heard before. It wasn't a volley, but a continuous, rolling thunder of shots. Mausers cracked and echoed, each bullet finding its mark with frightening precision. Private Jenkins hit the ground, his face pressed into the dirt as bullets whined overhead. He could taste the grit in his mouth, feel the thud of his heartbeat against the earth. All around him, men were shouting orders, warnings, prayers. A sergeant bellowed, "Forward, keep moving." And Jenkins lifted his head just long enough to see his captain waving the men onward. Step by step, they crawled, ducked, and sprinted through the smoke. The artillery behind them roared again, shaking the ground. Shells burst over the Boer trenches, scattering dirt and shrapnel. For a few seconds, the Mauser fire lessened. The British rose as one and surged forward another 100 yards. Then the firing started again. Lieutenant Arthur Thompson, leading his platoon of Gordons, felt the world shrink to the few yards around him. Men he'd trained with for months were dropping in silence. A bullet grazed his shoulder, another tore through the sleeve of his tunic. But the line held. Through the smoke and the screams, the skirl of bagpipes rose once more, eerie and defiant. The pipers stood tall, playing as if the music itself could drown out death. It worked. The men cheered, rallied, pushed on. The Highlanders advanced in short bursts, 50 yards at a time, then dropped to reload, their kilts flaring in the wind. The Manchesters mirrored them, grim and steady. The Boers, seeing the British pressing closer, redoubled their fire. The ridge erupted in smoke and flame. By early afternoon, the British were within rifle range of the Boer entrenchments. The artillery had done its work. The enemy's left flank showed signs of faltering. French seized the moment. He ordered the 5th Lancers and 5th Dragoon Guards to circle wide, moving unseen behind a low hill. Their mission, strike the Boers' retreat and cut them off from their horses. It was a gamble, but French thrived on risk. If it worked, the Boers would be trapped. If it failed, the cavalry might be destroyed. Still, there was no hesitation. Trumpets sounded in the distance, and the Lancers began their wide, sweeping move through the tall grass, their red pennons flickering like tongues of fire in the sunlight. Meanwhile, on the ridge, the fight was reaching its peak. The British infantry now faced the steepest slope. The air was alive with bullets. Rock splintered. Dust and smoke choked the lungs. Officers led from the front, shouting themselves hoarse to keep their men in line. Up the hill. Forward, lads, forward. Private Jenkins stumbled over a fallen comrade, his boot catching on a rifle strap. He looked down long enough to see a face, pale, still, eyes star. The ridge erupted in smoke and thunder. The roar of gunfire rolled down across the veldt like a living storm. Men shouted, stumbled, and rose again. Above it all came the relentless crash of British artillery, each explosion tearing at the sky. The Boers fought from behind their rocks with grim efficiency, but the weight of the assault was now upon them. The British had come too far to turn back. Lieutenant Arthur Thompson of the Gordon Highlanders felt the shock of a bullet slam into the ground beside him. He dropped flat, the dust hot against his cheek. Forward, he shouted, his voice hoarse. Around him, his men crawled and surged, inch by inch, through smoke and broken earth. The air burned with powder. He could smell blood, sweat, and iron. Below, General French watched the infantry press upward, their formation shredded but unbroken. His horse stamped nervously as shells burst in the distance. "Hold the artillery steady," he ordered. "Shift fire to the far ridge. Keep them pinned." The gunners obeyed, their hands raw and blistered from hours of loading. The guns spat fire once more, their shells screaming overhead toward the Boer line. At the foot of the ridge, Private Thomas Jenkins clutched his rifle, the barrel warm in his hands. Around him, men of the Manchester Regiment crouched behind a shallow lip of earth. "On my mark!" an officer shouted. The words barely carried through the roar. Then came the whistle. Jenkins rose with the others and ran. Bullets cracked and hissed. A man beside him spun and fell. Another dropped to his knees, clutching his stomach. Jenkins felt something tug at his sleeve but kept going. His legs moved on instinct. His breath came in ragged bursts. When he reached the next stretch of rock, he threw himself down, gasping. Above, the ridge seemed to burn with muzzle flashes. The Highlanders were climbing too, their bagpipes keening through the smoke. The notes cut through the chaos, defiant, wild, unyielding. It was madness to play under fire, but the sound lifted the hearts of every man who heard it. Thompson glanced back once and saw a piper still standing, his cheeks puffed, his kilt torn and dark with soot. The man played on, fearless. Step by step, the British line climbed the ridge. French knew they were close. Through his glass, he could see the Highlanders cresting a rise, could see the flashes of bayonets glinting through the haze. He turned to his aide. "Signal the cavalry," he said quietly. "They'll be needed soon." On the flank, the 5th Lancers and 5th Dragoon Guards waited, restless. Their horses pawed the ground, nostrils flaring at the scent of powder and fear. Major William Lowe, commanding the Lancers, lifted his saber and peered toward the ridge. He could see nothing but smoke and dust, but he could hear the fight. Soon, the order would come. Back on the slope, the battle had turned to close combat. The Highlanders reached the Boer trenches first. With a cry, they charged. The world narrowed to a blur of steel and flame. Bayonets met rifles. Men grappled and fell. The sharp crack of Mausers gave way to the harsh sound of hand-to-hand struggle, grunts, shouts, the thud of boots and fists. Thompson drove his bayonet forward and felt it strike. He wrenched it free, his ears ringing. Around him, his men fought like demons. The Boers were fierce, firing until the last second before drawing pistols or knives. But the British numbers were overwhelming. The Gordons swept through the first trench, the Manchesters through the second. A sergeant planted the Union Jack on a rock, the cloth snapping in the wind. A cheer rose, but it was drowned by the renewed roar of gunfire from the far side of the ridge. The Boers had fallen back to a second position, their artillery still firing. French saw it and grimaced. "They are not beaten yet," he muttered. "Bring up the reserves." The Devonshires, still fresh, advanced at a jog, their faces streaked with dust. The British guns shifted again, pouring fire onto the new Boer line. For half an hour the battle hung in balance. Each side poured everything they had into that narrow strip of land. Shells exploded. Horses screamed. The sky turned gray with smoke. And then, at last, the Boer fire began to falter. Their guns fell silent one by one. French saw his chance. He raised his arm toward the waiting cavalry. Now! Ride! The bugle sounded, sharp and bright. Across the plain, the 5th Lancers surged forward, sabers glinting, their pennons streaming red and white. The dragoons followed close behind. It was as if the past itself had come alive, a vision of war from another century. The thunder of hooves rolled like an avalanche across the veldt. The Boers, seeing the charge, tried to mount their horses and escape, but the Lancers were already upon them. The clash was sudden and terrible. Spears thrust. Sabers flashed. Men and horses crashed together in chaos. Dust swallowed the scene. French watched through the haze, his heart pounding. It was the last great cavalry charge of its kind, a moment of raw, reckless bravery before the age of machines would make such heroics obsolete. On the ridge, Jenkins watched the riders sweep past, awestruck. He had never seen anything like it. The sight filled him with something close to pride, but also dread. The field was a slaughterhouse now, and he knew too many of those men would not return. Within minutes, it was over. The Boers broke. Some threw down their rifles and raised their hands. Others fled into the long grass, pursued by the Lancers. The crackle of gunfire faded, replaced by the cries of the wounded and the low groan of the dying. General French rode up the slope, his horse stumbling among the rocks. Smoke drifted like fog. He dismounted at the crest and looked down. The ridge that had defied them all morning was theirs. Hold the position, he ordered quietly, and see to the wounded. The sun was sinking now, a molten disk behind the hills. The battlefield lay in ruin, shattered earth, splintered wagons, men sprawled in silence. The Highlanders stood among the stones, faces black with soot and sweat. Some leaned on their rifles, too tired to speak. Others searched for friends among the fallen. Lieutenant Thompson sank to his knees beside a wounded man and pressed a canteen to his lips. The soldier's eyes flickered open for a moment, then closed. Thompson sat back, numb. Victory felt hollow. Private Jenkins wandered the slope, his hands shaking. He found his captain, wounded but alive, propped against a rock. "We did it, sir," Jenkins whispered. The captain managed a weak smile. "Aye, lad, we did." Below, the cavalry returned slowly, leading captured Boers and limping horses. Their uniforms were torn, their faces streaked with dust and blood. French watched them pass and saluted. They had done their duty, every man. As darkness fell, the guns finally fell silent. The smoke cleared enough to reveal the valley below, peaceful again, almost indifferent to the suffering that had stained it. The men built fires and tended to the wounded. The chirp of crickets rose from the grass, soft and steady, as if the land itself were trying to forget. That night, French wrote in his journal, "Elandslaagte is ours. The enemy broken and dispersed. Our men fought with courage beyond measure. Yet I cannot shake the thought, this was but one ridge among many. The war ahead will be long." And as the stars emerged over the African sky, the exhausted British soldiers lay among their fallen comrades, the echoes of the day still ringing in their ears. The ridge was quiet now, but its memory of fire and steel would haunt them forever. The veldt lay shrouded in a haze of dust and smoke, the afternoon light bleeding red across the horizon. The guns had fallen quiet for a moment, an uneasy silence had hung over the battlefield like a hell breath. Then came the distant sound of bugles, faint at first, then rising sharp and clear. It was a call that would echo through history. The 5th Lancers formed up on the plain below Elandslaagte Ridge, their lines straight and gleaming in the dying sun. Horses pawed the ground, snorting, restless under the scent of blood and powder. The men adjusted their saddles, tightened grips on lances and sabers. Among them rode Major William Lowe, his face streaked with grime, eyes locked on the ridge ahead. He knew this order might be his last. It didn't matter. He would carry it out. Behind him, the 5th Dragoon Guards waited, heavy cavalry, their sabers drawn, their red tunics darkened by dust. The air was electric. Somewhere to the east, the sound of rifle fire still crackled, but the Boers were breaking. French had seen it from his vantage point and made his decision. The enemy was in retreat, disorganized, panicked, trying to flee toward their horses. This was the moment. French's hand came down sharply. Now! Ride! The bugles cried again, and the lancers spurred forward. The earth shook. Dust rose in clouds behind them. Hooves thundered like drums of war as they gathered speed, breaking from a trot to a gallop, then to a furious charge. Their pennons streamed red and white, slashing through the haze like blooded ribbons. The dragoons followed, sabers catching the sun. It was a sight out of time, Napoleonic grandeur reborn in an age of modern rifles. Against every lesson of the new century, flesh and steel raced into the teeth of fire. The Boers, scattered along the ridge far slope, saw them coming and scrambled for their mounts. Some fired wildly, others fled. Bullets whipped through the air. A horse screamed and went down, tumbling its rider into the date. Still the lancers came on, a wall of thunder and resolve. Major Lowe lifted his saber and shouted, "Lancers, charge!" The line hit the Boer flank like a hammer. Men and horses collided in a blur of motion and violence. Lancers thrust, sabers flashed, and cries of pain split the air. Boer riflemen tried to stand and shoot point-blank, but the impact was too sudden. Horses crashed through their line, scattering them like chaff. Private George Ridley, barely 20, felt his lance strike home. The shot jarred his arm to the shoulder. Then the weapon was gone, ripped from his grasp. He drew his revolver, firing blindly into the smoke. The world was chaos, dust, gunfire, screams. He couldn't tell friend from foe, only that the charge had torn through. Behind them, the dragoons wheeled in, their sabers rising and falling like a scythe. The plain was madness now, a swirl of men and horses, bayonets and lances, smoke and blood. Somewhere in the maelstrom, Lowe's voice rang out, calm and commanding, "Rally on me, form again." They regrouped swiftly, astonishingly. The discipline held. French's vision of combined arms had come alive, infantry on the ridge, artillery pounding from behind, and cavalry cutting off the enemy escape. For a few minutes, it was textbook perfection, the kind officers dreamed of and never saw. But war is never perfect. A sudden volley tore through the ranks. Boer marksmen, hidden among the rocks, poured fire into the horsemen. Men toppled from the saddle. Horses reared and fell. The lancers swerved, regrouped, and charged again, driven more by momentum than orders. Ridley saw Lowe ahead, saber flashing, leading the final surge. When they reached the Boer wagon line, resistance collapsed. The enemy fled in all directions. Some threw down rifles and raised their hands. Others vanished into the long grass. The field was littered with bodies, men, horses, broken weapons. It was over. The lancers had done what cavalry had done for centuries, shattered the enemy and sealed the victory. From the ridge above, Lieutenant Arthur Thompson watched in awe. The sun was low now, a deep gold sinking behind the hills. The cavalry looked like phantoms riding through smoke. "My God," he whispered, "they've done it." General French lowered his field glasses. For a long moment, he said nothing. He knew what it had cost. The lancers had paid dearly, too many gone, too many dying even now on the plain below. But their charge had broken the Boers completely. The battle was won. "Send word," he said softly to his aide. "The ridge is ours." As dusk fell, the guns went silent at last. The men of the Highlanders and Manchesters moved among the wounded, carrying stretchers, fetching water, murmuring words of comfort. The field smelled of smoke and blood. The once bright uniforms were black with dust and sweat. Major Lowe rode slowly through the wreckage, his arm bleeding, his horse limping. He passed the bodies of his men, lancers who had ridden with him into legend. One had died with his lance still clenched in his hand. Another lay with his face turned toward the sunset. Lowe stopped and removed his cap. "Brave lads," he murmured. "Brave to the end." Not far away, Private Jenkins helped lift a wounded dragoon from the ground. The man's eyes fluttered open. "Did we win?" he asked weakly. Jenkins hesitated, then nodded. "Aye, we won." The dragoon smiled faintly. "Then it was worth it." His eyes closed again, and Jenkins swallowed hard. As night descended, the battlefield grew quiet. Fires burned low along the ridge. The Highlanders stood watch, their silhouettes dark against the glow. French's staff moved through the camp, gathering reports. The toll was heavy, but the victory complete. Elandslaagte had been taken. The Boers had been routed. For the first time in the war, British arms had triumphed decisively. The men should have been jubilant. Instead, they sat in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. The cost of glory lay all around them. In the distance, thunder rolled across the plains, not from guns, but from the gathering storm. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady. It washed the blood from the stones, turning the dust to mud. The fires hissed and died. Under the gray sky, General French looked once more toward the ridge. The Union Jack fluttered weakly in the rain. He turned to his aide and spoke barely above a whisper. "This will be remembered," he said, "but God help us for what it took." The wind carried his words away, lost among the cries of the wounded and the whisper of the rain. The Battle of Elandslaagte was over, but its echoes would endure long after the smoke had cleared, in the hearts of those who survived, and in the silence of those who did not. The battlefield of Elandslaagte was quiet at last. Night had fallen, and the harsh sun of the day had been replaced by a pale, silver light from the rising moon. Fires smoldered across the ridge, casting long, trembling shadows over the uneven ground. The cries of the wounded were faint now, carried away by the wind or swallowed by the darkness. The carnage of the day lay bare, broken rifles, twisted bayonets, scattered ammunition, and the still forms of men and horses alike. Private Thomas Jenkins sat on a low rise, staring at the horizon. His uniform was blackened with soot and dust, his hands and face streaked with grime and blood that wasn't all his own. He thought of the charge, the climb, the roar of the Highlanders' pipes, and the thundering hooves of the cavalry. Every memory of that day seemed to clash with the eerie calm of night. He shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of what they had endured. Lieutenant Arthur Thompson moved carefully among the fallen, checking the living and the dead. His own wounds were minor, but he felt the heavy burden of command. Faces he knew were gone, friends, comrades, men whose courage had inspired him. Thompson paused beside one of the Highlanders, a young man who had fought with unmatched ferocity but would never see another sunrise. He touched the man's shoulder lightly, offering a silent respect. The Highlanders' bagpipes, which had pierced the chaos early in the day, now lay quiet, a symbol of the bravery and the cost of the fight. Major General John French walked slowly along the ridge, his horse limping but steady. He had seen victory, yes, but he had also seen the price exacted. The Boers had been defeated, their positions captured, and the railway line reopened. Yet the ground was soaked with the sweat, blood, and fear of men who had given everything. French stopped to observe the aftermath, the wounded being tended, the exhausted regiments trying to regain composure, the few remaining Boers escorted away under guard. He allowed himself a moment to breathe, to understand the significance of what had been achieved. This battle had proven something essential. British arms, when coordinated with discipline and courage, could overcome fortified positions even in the age of modern rifles. The combination of artillery barrages, infantry advances, and cavalry flanking had worked flawlessly on paper and remarkably in reality. Yet the battle had also revealed the harsh truth of modern warfare. Even a tactical success came at a cost measured not in territory alone, but in human lives. Stories would circulate of heroism and daring. The Highlanders' relentless climb and charge would be spoken of in mess holes for years. The Lancers' cavalry attack, one of the last of its kind, would enter military lore, a dramatic and haunting reminder of an era of mounted warfare now fading into history. But behind the tales of glory lay the raw and unvarnished human experience. Fear, exhaustion, courage, and suffering intertwined on a battlefield that tested the limits of every man who fought. Private Jenkins finally stood, brushing the dust from his uniform. He looked across the ridge toward the distant plains where the Boers had fled, and then down at the bodies of men who had fallen, many still clutching rifles, sabers, or each other. He swallowed hard, a lump in his throat. Victory had been theirs, but it was hollow in the sense that the cost would never be forgotten. The cries, the screams, the explosions, they had imprinted themselves on his mind and would linger for years. Lieutenant Thompson gathered his officers and began organizing the men. The wounded needed transport, the dead required burial, and the regiments had to be reformed before dawn. Yet even in the midst of this grim task, there was a sense of pride, quiet and deep. They had faced one of the most formidable challenges of their lives and prevailed. Each man carried a memory of bravery, some of their own, some of their comrades, etched indelibly into the story of the battle. Major General French, observing the organized effort, allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. History would record Elandslaagte as a decisive victory, but he knew that statistics and accounts of troop movements could never fully convey the reality of what had transpired. The courage of individual soldiers, the split-second decisions under fire, the sheer endurance of men facing death and chaos, these were the true measures of the day. He turned his gaze to the dark horizon, aware that this battle, though complete, was only a prelude to a far greater war. The night air was heavy with the scent of smoke and sweat. Fires burned low, their glow casting eerie silhouettes against the ridge. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied. Somewhere else, a soldier whispered a prayer for a fallen friend. The human cost was immense, yet the battle had revealed something timeless. Courage in the face of insurmountable odds, the power of coordination and leadership, and the resilience of men who carried the flag of their nation into the jaws of danger. As dawn approached, the survivors would rise, weary but unbroken. They would remember the sounds, the sights, the fear, and the exhilaration of the day. They would tell stories of the ridge, the charge, and the relentless advance. And history would remember, too, not only the tactical brilliance of Major General French, but the human spirit that had endured, fought, and triumphed on that fateful October day. The Battle of Elandslaagte would remain a testament to both the possibilities and the perils of war, the brilliance of strategy and the bravery of soldiers tempered by the stark reality of mortality. It was a victory, yes, a decisive, tactical triumph that reopened railways and struck a blow against the Boers. But it was also a human story of sacrifice and endurance, of men who faced the unimaginable and carried on. And as the first rays of sunlight began to pierce the horizon, casting gold across the veldt, the survivors looked out from the ridge, knowing they had witnessed history. The ridge was silent now, but the echoes of valor, fear, and sacrifice would resonate forever in their minds and in the chronicles of the British Army. Elandslaagte was won, yet its memory endured as a reminder of what war demanded, what courage could achieve, and what it would always cost. In the end, the victory was complete, yet incomplete. The British flag waved over the ridge, the Boers were in retreat, and the men had proven their skill and courage. But in the hearts of those who survived, the images of the dead, the cries of the wounded, and the chaos of battle lingered, a permanent reminder that every triumph in war was paid for in blood, sweat, and sacrifice. The Battle of Elandslaagte had ended, but its legacy, the lessons learned, the valor displayed, and the price exacted, would endure long after the smoke had cleared.